Hello there, how are you? I hope everything is very well with you. Everything's very well with me. My name is Gildart, for those of you who don't know, and I'm an actor, and I'm currently on a TV show called The Bold Type, which is very good, I think, and if you'd like to check that out, please do. But I also thank you for joining me here on Fireside Reading, which I've been doing since almost the beginning of the coronavirus lockdown. We've read many books, and we're in the middle of a favorite of mine, old favorite of mine, The Inimitable Jeeves. The Inimitable Jeeves was written by P.G. Wodehouse in the 1920s, and it's a series of his short stories about Jeeves and Wooster that ultimately he compiled into this book. So it's a sort of series of little stories stitched together. And we're in the middle of one of the stories. Jeeves and Wooster have left to go to New York because Jeeves is terrified of his Aunt Agatha. Aunt Agatha disapproved of his getting out of engagement, and so he fled to New York. Only having gotten there, Aunt Agatha sent him a letter of introduction to Cyril Bassington, who arrived and wanted to hang out with Bertie. The only rule was that Bertie couldn't introduce him to anything to do with the stage. And of course, immediately, Cyril Bassington got a part on the stage because Bertie introduced him to his friend George, who's a writer. So with that, we now welcome you to a fireside reading of The Inimitable Jeeves, Chapter 10. Startling dressiness of a lift attendant. I should also remind you that Jeeves and Wooster are having a bit of an altercation because Wooster wants to wear his purple socks. I know those aren't purple, but they're as good as I can do. And Jeeves thoroughly disapproves of purple socks. So that's why Jeeves hasn't come to the help of Bertie yet. Chapter 10, Startling Dressiness of a Lift Attendant. The part which old George had written for the chump Cyril took up about 2 pages of typescript, but it might have been Hamlet the way that poor misguided pinhead worked himself to the bone over it. I suppose if I heard him his lines once, I did it 12 times in the first couple of days. He seemed to think that my only feeling about the whole affair was one of enthusiastic admiration, and that he could rely on my support and sympathy. What with trying to imagine how Aunt Agatha was going to take this thing, and being woken up out of the dreamless in the small hours every other night to give my opinion on some new bit of business which Cyril had invented, I became more or less the good old shadow. And all the time, Jeeves remained still pretty cold and distant about the purple socks. It's this sort of thing that ages a chappie, don't you know, and makes his youthful joie de vivre go a bit groggy at the knees. In the middle of it, Aunt Agatha's letter arrived. It took her about 6 pages to do justice to Cyril's father's feelings in regard to his going on the stage, and about 6 more to give me a kind of sketch of what she would say, think, and do if I didn't keep him clear of injurious influences while he was in America. The letter came by the afternoon mail and left me with a pretty firm conviction that it wasn't a thing I ought to keep to myself. I didn't even wait to ring the bell. I whizzed for the kitchen, bleating for Jeeves, and butted into the middle of a regular tea party of sorts. Seated at the table were a depressing-looking cove, who might have been the valet or something, and a boy in a Norfolk suit. The valet chappie was drinking a whiskey and soda, and the boy was being tolerably rough with some jam and cake. "Oh, I say, Jeeves," I said, "sorry to interrupt the feast of reason and flow of soul and so forth, but..." At this juncture, the small boy's eye hit me like a bullet and stopped me in my tracks. He was one of those cold, clammy, accusing sort of eyes, the kind that makes you reach up to see if your tie is straight. And he looked at me as if I was some sort of unnecessary product which Cuthbert the cat had brought in after a ramble among the local ash cans. He was a stoutish infant with a lot of freckles and a good deal of jam on his face. "Hello, hello, hello," I said. "What?" There didn't seem much else to say. The stripling stared at me in a nasty sort of way through the jam. He may have loved me at first sight, but the impression he gave me was that he didn't think a lot of me and wasn't betting much that I would improve a great deal on acquaintance. I had a kind of feeling that I was about as popular with him as a cold Welsh rabbit. "What's your name?" he asked. "My name? Oh, Wooster, don't you know, and whatnot." "My pop's richer than you are." That seemed to be all about me. The child, having said his say, started in on the jam again. I turned to Jeeves. "I say, Jeeves, can you spare a moment? I want to show you something." "Very good, sir." We toddled into the sitting room. "Who is your little friend, Sidney the Sunbeam, Jeeves?" "The young gentleman, sir?" "It's a loose way of describing him, but I know what you mean." "I trust I was not taking a liberty in entertaining him, sir." "Not a bit. No, if that's your idea of a large afternoon, go ahead." "I happened to meet the young gentleman taking a walk with his father's valet, sir, whom I used to know somewhat intimately in London, and I ventured to invite them both to join me here." "Well, never mind about him, Jeeves. Read this letter." He gave it the up and down. "Very disturbing, sir," was all he could find to say. "Well, what are we going to do about it?" "Time may provide a solution, sir." "On the other hand, it mayn't. What?" "Extremely true, sir." Well, we got as far as this when there was a ring at the door. Jeeves shimmered off and Cyril blew in, full of good cheer and blitheringness. "I say, Wooster, old thing," he said, "I want your advice. You know this jolly old part of mine. How ought I to dress it? What I mean is, the first act scene is laid in a hotel of sorts at about 3 in the afternoon. What ought I to wear, do you think?" I wasn't feeling fit for a discussion of gents' suitings. "Well, you'd better consult Jeeves," I said. A hot and by no means unripe idea. Where is he?" "Gone back to the kitchen, I suppose." "Well, I'll smite the good old bell, shall I? Yes? No?" "Righto." Jeeves poured silently in. "Oh, I say, Jeeves," began Cyril, "I just wanted to have a syllable or two with you. It's this way. Hello? Who's this?" I then perceived that the stout stripling had trickled into the room after Jeeves. He was standing near the door looking at Cyril as if his worst fears had been realized. There was a bit of a silence. The child remained there drinking Cyril in for about half a minute, and then he gave his verdict. "Fish face."
"Eh? What?"
said Cyril. The child, who had evidently been taught at his mother's knee to speak the truth, made his meaning a trifle clearer. "You've a face like a fish." He spoke as if Cyril was more to be pitied than censured, which I am bound to say I thought rather decent and broad-minded of him. I don't mind admitting that whenever I looked at Cyril's face, I always had a feeling that he couldn't have got that way without it being mostly his own fault. I found myself warming to the child. Absolutely, don't you know? I liked his conversation. It seemed to take Cyril a moment or two, really, to grasp the thing, and then you could hear the blood of the Bassingtons begin to sizzle.
Well, I'm dashed, he said. I'm dashed if I'm not.
I wouldn't have a face like that, proceeded the child with a good deal of earnestness. Not if you gave me $1 million. He thought for a moment, then corrected himself. $2 million, he added. Just what occurred then, I couldn't exactly say, but the next few minutes were a bit exciting. I take it that Cyril must have made a dive for the instant. Anyway, the air seemed pretty well congested with arms and legs and things. Something bumped into the Worcester waistcoat just around the third button, and I collapsed onto the settee and rather lost interest in things for the moment. When I had unscrambled myself, I found that Jeeves and the child had retired, and Cyril was standing in the middle of the room, snorting a bit.
Who's that frightful brute, Worcester?
I don't know. I never saw him before today.
I just gave him a couple of tolerably juicy buffets before he legged it. I say, Worcester, that kid said a dashed odd thing. He yelled out something about Jeeves promising him $1 if he called me, what he said.
It sounded pretty unlikely to me. What would Jeeves do that for?
It struck me as rummy, too.
Where would be the sense of it?
That's what I can't see.
I mean to say, it's nothing to Jeeves what sort of a face you have.
No,
said Cyril. He spoke a little coldly, I fancied. I don't know why.
Well, I'll be popping. Toodle-oo.
Pip-pip. It must have been about a week after this rummy little episode that George Caffin called me up and asked me if I would care to go and see a run-through of his show. Ask Dad, it seemed, was to open out of town in Schenectady on the following Monday, and this was to be a sort of preliminary dress rehearsal. A preliminary dress rehearsal, old George explained, was the same as a regular dress rehearsal inasmuch as it was apt to look like nothing on earth and last into the small hours, but more exciting because they wouldn't be timing the piece, and consequently all the blighters who on these occasions let their angry passions rise would have plenty of scope for interruptions, with the result that a pleasant time would be had by all. The thing was billed to start at 8 o'clock, so I rolled up at 10:15, so as not to have too long to wait before they began. The dress parade was still going on. George was on the stage talking to a cove in shirt sleeves and an absolutely round chappie with big spectacles and a practically hairless dome. I had seen George with the latter merchant once or twice at the club, and I knew that he was Blumenfield, the manager. I waved to George and slid into a seat at the back of the house so as to be out of the way when the fighting started. Presently, George hopped down off the stage and came and joined me, and fairly soon after that, the curtain went down. The chappie at the piano whacked out a well-meant bar or two, and the curtain went up again. I can't quite recall what the plot of Ask Dad was about, but I do know that it seemed able to jog along all right without much help from Cyril. I was rather puzzled at first. What I mean is, through brooding on Cyril and hearing him in his part and listening to his views on what ought and what ought not to be done, I suppose I'd got the impression, rooted in the old bean, that he was pretty well the backbone of the show, and that the rest of the company didn't do much except go on and fill in when he happened to be off the stage. I sat there for nearly half an hour waiting for him to make his entrance until I suddenly discovered he had been on from the start. He was, in fact, the rummy-looking, plug-ugly one who was leaning against a potted palm a couple of feet from the OP side, trying to appear intelligent while the heroine sang a song about love being like something which, for the moment, has slipped my memory. After the second refrain, he began to dance in company with a dozen other equally weird birds, a painful spectacle for one who could see a vision of Aunt Agatha reaching for the hatchet and old Bassington Sr. putting on his strongest pair of hobnailed boots. Yeah, absolutely. The dance had just finished, and Cyril and his plans had shuffled off into the wings when a voice spoke from the darkness on my right. "Pop!" Old Blumenfield clapped his hands, and the hero, who'd just been about to get the next line off his diaphragm, cheesed it. I peered into the shadows. Who should it be but Jeeves's little playmate with the freckles? He was now strolling down the aisle with his hands in his pockets as if the place belonged to him. An air of respectful attention seemed to pervade the building. "Pop," said the stripling, "that number's no good." Old Blumenfield beamed over his shoulder. "Don't you like it, darling?" "It gives me a pain." "You're dead right." "You want something zippy there, something with a bit of jazz to it." "Quite right, my boy. I'll make a note of it. All right. Go on." I turned to George, who was muttering to himself in rather an overwrought way. "I say, George, old man, who the dickens is that kid?" Old George groaned a bit hollowly, as if things were a trifle thick. "I didn't know he'd crawled in. It's Blumenfield's son. Now we're going to have a Hades of a time." "Does he always run things like this?" "Always." "Why does old Blumenfield listen to him?" "Nobody seems to know. It may be pure fatherly love, or he may regard him as a mascot. My own idea is that he thinks the kid has exactly the amount of intelligence of the average member of the audience, and that what makes a hit with him will please the general public, while conversely what he doesn't like will be too rotten for anyone. The kid is a pest, a wart, and a pot of poison, and should be strangled." The rehearsal went on. The hero got off his line. There was a slight outburst of frightfulness between the stage manager and a voice named Bill that came from somewhere near the roof, the subject under discussion being where the devil Bill's ambers were at that particular juncture. Then things went on again until the moment arrived for Cyril's big scene. I was still a trifle hazy about the plot, but I'd got on to the fact that Cyril was some sort of an English peer who had come over to America, doubtless for the best reasons. So far, he'd only had 2 lines to say. One was, "Oh, I say," and the other was, "Yes, by Jove." But I seem to recollect from hearing him read his part that pretty soon he was due rather to spread himself. So I sat back in my chair and waited for him to bob up. He bobbed up about 5 minutes later. Things had got a bit stormy by that time. The voice and the stage director had had another of their love feasts, this time something to do with why Bill's blues weren't on the job for something. And almost as soon as that was over, there was a bit of unpleasantness because a flower pot fell off a window ledge and nearly brained the hero. The atmosphere was consequently more or less hotted up when Cyril, who had been hanging about at the back of the stage, breezed down centre and towed the mark for his most substantial chunk of entertainment. The heroine had been saying something, I forget what, and all the chorus, with Cyril at their head, had begun to surge round her in the restless sort of way these chappies always do when there's a number coming along. Cyril's first line was, "Oh, I say, you know, you mustn't say that, really." And it seemed to me he passed it over the larynx with a goodish deal of vim and je ne sais quoi. But by Jove, before the heroine had time for the comeback, our little friend with the freckles had risen to lodge a protest. "Pop!" "Yes, darling." "That one's no good." "Which one, darling?" "The one with a face like a fish." "But they all have faces like fish, darling." The child seemed to see the justice of the objection. He became more definite. "The ugly one." "Which ugly one?" "That one," said old Blumenfield, pointing to Cyril. "Yep, he's rotten." "I thought so myself. He's a pill." "You're dead right, my boy. I've noticed it for some time." Cyril had been gaping a bit while these few remarks were in progress. He now shot down to the footlights. Even from where I was sitting, I could see that these harsh words had hit the old Bassington family pride a frightful wallop. He started to get pink in the ears, and then in the nose, and then in the cheeks, till in about a quarter of a minute he looked pretty much like an explosion in a tomato cannery on a sunset evening.
"What the deuce do you mean?"
"What the deuce do you mean?" shouted old Blumenfield. "Don't yell at me across the footlights."
"I've a dashed good mind to come down and spank that little brute."
"What?"
"A dashed good mind."
Old Blumenfield swelled like a pumped-up tire. He got rounder than ever. "See here, mister, I don't know your darn name."
"My name's Bassington, and the jolly old Bassingtons, I mean the Bassingtons, aren't accustomed..."
Old Blumenfield told him in a few brief words pretty much what he thought of the Bassingtons and what they weren't accustomed to. The whole strength of the company rallied round to enjoy his remarks. You could see them jutting out from the wings and protruding from behind trees. "You got to work good for my pop," said the stout child, waggling his head reprovingly at Cyril.
"I don't want any bally cheek from you,"
said Cyril, gurgling a bit.
"What's that?"
barked old Blumenfield.
"Do you understand that this boy is my son?" "Yes, I do," said Cyril. "And you both have my sympathy."
"You're fired," bellowed old Blumenfield, swelling a good bit more.
"Get out of my theater."
About 10:30 next morning, just after I had finished lubricating the good old interior with a soothing cup of oolong, Jeeves filtered into my bedroom and said that Cyril was waiting to see me in the sitting room. "How does he look, Jeeves?" "Sir?" "What does Mr. Bassington look like?" "It is hardly my place, sir, to criticize the facial peculiarities of your friends." "I don't mean that. I mean, does he appear peeved and what not?" "Not noticeably, sir. His manner is tranquil." "That's rum." "Sir?" "Nothing. Show him in, will you?" I'm bound to say I'd expected to see Cyril showing a few more traces of last night's battle. I was looking for a bit of the overwrought soul and the quivering ganglions, if you know what I mean. He seemed pretty ordinary and quite fairly cheerful.
"Hello, Wooster, old thing."
"Cheero."
"I just looked in to say goodbye."
"Goodbye?"
"Yes, I'm off to Washington in an hour." He sat down on my bed. "You know, Wooster, old top," he went on, "I've been thinking it all over, and really it doesn't seem quite fair to the jolly old governor, my going on the stage and so forth. What do you think?"
"I see what you mean."
"I mean to say, he sent me over here to broaden my jolly old mind and words to that effect, don't you know, and I can't help thinking it would be a bit of a jar for the old boy if I gave him the bird and went on the stage instead. I don't know if you understand me, but what I mean to say is it's a sort of a question of conscience."
can you leave the show without upsetting everyone?
Oh, that's all right. I've explained everything to old Blumenfield, and he quite sees my position. Of course, he's sorry to lose me. He said he didn't even know how he could fill my place and all that sort of thing. But after all, even if it does land him in a bit of a hole, I think I'm right in resigning my part, don't you?
Oh, absolutely.
I thought you'd agree with me. Well, I ought to be shifting. Awfully glad to have seen something of you and all that sort of rot. Pip, pip.
Toodaloo. He sallied forth, having told all those bally lies with the clear, blue-eyed pop gaze of a young child. I rang for Jeeves. You know, ever since last night, I had been exercising the old bean to some extent, and a good deal of light had dawned on me. Jeeves? Sir? Did you put that pie-faced infant up to ballyragging Mr. Bassington? Sir? Oh, you know what I mean. Did you tell him to get Mr. Bassington sacked from the Ask Dad company?
I would not take such a liberty, sir.
He started to pull out my clothes. It is possible that young Master Blumenfield may have gathered from casual remarks of mine that I did not consider the stage altogether a suitable sphere for Mr. Bassington.
I say, Jeeves, you know, you're a bit of a marvel.
I endeavour to give satisfaction, sir. And I'm frightfully obliged, if you know what I mean. Aunt Agatha would have had 16 or 17 fits if you hadn't headed her off. If you hadn't headed him off. I fancy there might have been some little friction and unpleasantness, sir. I am laying out the blue suit with the thin red stripes, sir. I fancy the effect will be pleasing. It's a rummy thing, but I'd finished breakfast and gone out and got as far as the lift before I remembered what it was that I'd meant to do to reward Jeeves for his really sporting behaviour in this matter of the chump Cyril. It cut me to the heart to do it, but I had decided to give him his way and let those purple socks pass out of my life. After all, there are times when a cove must make sacrifices. I was just going to nip back and break the glad news to him when the lift came up, so I thought I would leave it till I got home. The chappie in charge of the lift looked at me as I hopped in with a good deal of quiet devotion and whatnot. "I wish to thank you, sir," he said, "for your kindness." "Eh, what?" "Mr. Jeeves give me their purple socks, as you told him to, sir. Thank you very much." I looked down. The blighter was a blaze of mauve from the ankle bone southward. I don't know when I've ever seen anything quite so dressy. Not at all. Righto. I'm glad you like 'em, I said. Well, I mean to say, what? Absolutely. Thank you for joining me. I look forward very much to seeing you all tomorrow for the same time and place and the next chapter of Fireside Reading. Until then, please be very well. Good night. Cheerio.